Parker introduced me, which I'm grateful for. I'm probably about half as good as what he kind of made it sound like I am, but it's always good to be honored, and I feel that here. And it always feels so much like home when I just step into this place, and I'm guessing I'm not alone in that. I think as people step in, just the vibe and what you guys have going on here, just the presence of God here is evident, and it's just a great place to be. I think I was thinking about this today, just stepping in here, it's almost like I felt like there was a little bit of healing that was even just taking place in my heart and my mind just by being present here. And I think that's kind of what you guys bring to the table and how you're allowing God to work through you and your faith. And it's beautiful. And I know, generally speaking, I'm probably one of the older people here, and my wife and I are older. We're coming up on almost 40 years of marriage, which is pretty crazy, right? It's pretty, mostly because I've done a good job. My wife's okay, but I've done a really good job. But actually, she's here, and she's amazing. Carol Ann is back there. And the greatest evidence I ever point to that there is a God in heaven is that woman married me. I mean, if there wasn't a God in heaven, how on earth would she marry someone like me? But she did. And 40 years, but we know we're getting older. We go to go to weddings, they have those dances. And it's like the last couple And we still haven't won one of those things, but my wife and I now, we're both really competitive. We start looking around, and it's like, okay, there's an older couple. You take their walker, so we'll take their walker, right? And we'll pinch off their oxygen tubes so they can't make it out to the dance floor so that we win. So that's kind of it. Yeah, so whatever it is to win. But I was thinking, and I don't know why this hit me this morning, but my wife and I, we got married at 19 and 18, pretty young. We had kids 14 months into marriage. We have 3 daughters, 4 grandkids. So there's a lot of life that we've experienced, planted a church, done a ton of really cool things. But I remember our daughters are like 10, I think about like 11, 9, and 7. And you kind of do that will thing, like if something happens to you, who gets the kids? And I remember we had family members that were going to take them, but both of us around the same time just didn't feel really bad about that, but we felt like we could do better. And it's so remarkable. I look back, and maybe this just shows how naive we were and how dumb we were and all that. But there was this one person that God both placed on our heart that if something happened to us, we would want this person to take our 3 girls. And it was a 26-year-old single dude. Is that goofy? So we told him, and he's like, no, dude, don't do that to me. But no, he was very gracious. And I just thought there was something about that season of life and how you're growing and how you're learning, and you've got these good things going on and these challenging things going on, and how we were kind of drawn to that. Man, we want our daughters to experience that from someone that is a wonderful man of faith and can lead them really well. Well, we actually ended up sticking around, and he's married and has 3 boys now, which is kind of interesting that he has 3 boys. But yeah, I love being here. I love the vibe here. So fun to just be with you guys and get to share a little bit on this day, which is really a special day. I think for me, caring for the vulnerable, that's been in my heart for a long time, to different degrees of sacrifice, devotion I've been willing to make. I've been, a pastor in leadership, so trying to encourage, inform, inspire others toward that. That's been part of me. But there was a moment now about 12 years ago where it just went to another level. Everything I thought I had been committed to all of a sudden took on new meaning. And it was really just a brief little moment, but it changed everything for me. I was pastor of a church. We did trips. We went down to Bolivia. We had sponsored our church, hundreds of children in Bolivia. We went down to see them, to spend time with the pastors there. And we did a home visit, and we're in this one home, and the mother places this little tiny baby girl in my arms. And she couldn't have weighed more than maybe 5 or 6 pounds. And from everything I knew, she's perfectly healthy, but just this really little dinkster, little tiny girl. And so we're carrying on this conversation in Spanish, and I said, well, what's this little girl's name? And the mother looked up to me and just quickly said, oh, her name is Clara. And my wife was in the room with me, and I dare not look at her because there's going to be like big sobbing and like just really horrific crying that's going to be coming out of my body. I'm going to start convulsing when I hear that, because here's what happened. Here I'm holding this little girl that's 4 weeks old, right? 4 weeks prior to that trip, our first granddaughter was born. a little girl named Clara. And you know how you can have 1,000 things go through your mind all at the same time, man? I experienced that. And in the moment, it's like, okay, I couldn't get my mind around, like, here are two little girls born on close to the exact same day with the exact same name, but because they were born in different parts of the world, to different communities, to different parents, the probable trajectory of their life was dramatically different. And there was something in my heart that broke in a new way that day that said, it can't be that way anymore. What can I do? What should I do so that the little Claires that are born into poverty, the outlook for their life could be dramatically different and change? And it was such an incredible day. And so when I get to pause and speak and talk a little bit about the plight of the orphan or the vulnerable, man, I always look forward to doing that. And I always reflect back on that day where I feel like I went a little bit deeper. I went a little bit broader in what I wanted to do. Such a powerful thing. And I know you guys have been talking about more than enough, right? And I think the best definition that I know of poverty, really the definition of poverty is really less than enough, right? So prosperity is not the opposite of poverty. You know what the opposite of poverty is? It's enough. And so if you have more than enough, man, think of the different place that you are in. And I think the things we forget sometimes, poverty just isn't a lack of food, and it isn't, a lack of clean water and opportunity and all those things, although they're all true. Often all those things work together, and poverty becomes this enemy that just takes away hope from people. Takes away hope. And so what we have the opportunity to do, those of us who have enough, who have more than enough, we have the opportunity to use a little bit of some of our more than enough so that those with less than enough, their hope can be restored and they can have a greater understanding of who they are as a child of God. And so the thing I want to talk about today is just how true it is, and it's already been alluded to this morning a little bit, but that today's decision is tomorrow's story. I'm certainly not the first one to ever say that, but think how true that is. Today's decision is tomorrow's story, right? It's always been true. We have stories, right, good and bad, that are certainly beyond our personal choice. I'm an adopted kid, all right? Yay, any other adopted kids in here? I don't know. Is that okay to ask? Yay, adopted kids. They're my favorite people. It's my favorite part of my life stories that I'm an adopted kid. And in the most technical sense, I was an orphan for 7 days. So I don't know that I can really identify completely with the plight of many orphans. I don't remember, laying in my little crib in the hospital trying to, convince anyone to take care of me or any of that. But I was adopted when I was 7 days old, and my adoption story is beautifully non-incredible. This just could not be less incredible. And that, to me, that's what makes it beautiful and awesome. My parents, they don't have this long, we prayed forever and we did this and this thread of, there wasn't infertility and there wasn't all these other things. It was just like, they kind of let it be known, like, maybe we'll adopt a kid someday. And they got their name in the hopper somewhere. And then one day, they got a call from the hospital and said, hey, we have this little redheaded boy. Would you like him? And my mom actually tells a story this way. She says, we thought, yeah, we'll take him. And there you go. That's my beautiful adoption story, right? I know you're wiping the tears away. I know that's heartbreaking. I know that's beautiful. But I can't tell you, if you know how I'm wired, how beautifully perfect that is for who I am. I absolutely love it. My parents could not have been more average, and that's what made them spectacular. I'm just an adopted kid. And somebody made a decision one day, and the trajectory of my life changed forever. And it wasn't even this overly profound decision, which is the thing I want to emphasize here. It wasn't, I think great profound decisions are awesome. Prayerful decisions are amazing. But sometimes just a decision where you're like, that's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it. That's enough. That's enough. And it's something that we can all do. So I'm an adopted kid, right? And I remember being an adopted kid. That was always my favorite thing about me. I would literally, I wasn't overly tough. I got in a lot of fights when I was a little kid. I wasn't overly tough, had a really bad temper. But man, I could slice and dice people verbally, had some communication skill. And so I can remember so many times saying, I don't even know if your parents probably didn't even want you, but my parents wanted me because I was adopted. That's the posture I took, right? And honestly, at the deepest part of my heart, I still feel a little bit better than most people because my parents really, really wanted me, all right? I don't know about yours, but mine really did. So that's what you're dealing with this guy up here. Listen, a decision there that I had no choice in wrote a totally different story for my life. Thank God. But there are things that happen that are part of our story that we don't have any decision in that still happen, right? My father died 6 days before my wedding. Man, there were some harsh realities that came out of that and growing up as a young man without a dad. Really, really hard. That wasn't as a result of my decision, but that was still this story that happened. So I'm not saying that everything that happens to us or everything that happens for us is the result of a decision we make, but I am saying that our responses and our actions today, the decisions we make today, they're going to write the stories for tomorrow. And stories, think about the stories that you love. The ones that you love to hear, the ones that you love to tell. Aren't they powerful because they move us in some way? They make us laugh, they make us cry, they make us think a little bit different, they make us mad, whatever the case may be. But that's so powerful. I remember several years ago reading this article in Runner's World, and it was about this woman who just one day, kind of out of nowhere, just decided to go running. And she went running, and the story kind of unpacks how she went from meth to marathons. And this is several years ago, but when I read the story, she had now logged about 80,000 miles and no longer had addiction problems, lived her life in a whole different way. One day she decided to go running, and that decision ended up writing this beautiful, different story. And I think that for all of us, there's these stories, right, where there's this brokenness. And there's this hope, and maybe even this hope in Jesus. And these stories are birthed out of there. And so since we're talking about stories, I went through Luke 7, wrote something about what maybe, this is kind of conjecture on my part, but maybe a retelling of Luke 7, if you're familiar with that. And we're talking about stories that seem like a good time to share a story. I'm an older grandfatherly type. I can share a story. This is good. All right, so I encourage you guys just to follow along. She had a name, but she was best known as that woman. She knew what it was like to be alone, even in the intimate presence of a stranger. For the umpteenth day in a row, she had been used. The man did not talk to her. He took what he wanted and rushed out of her bed. The pay was little, the shame enormous. When she wasn't numb, she swayed between anger and anguish. More than anything, she felt empty and hopeless. Like most days, she found a dose of solace by isolating herself in a nearby alley. But on this day, her stay in the alley would be short because in the distance, she heard an unusual commotion. She decided to investigate and walk past the garbage in the alley and turned the corner and headed toward the noise. With each step, she tried to put herself together the best she could. She held her head high, she strained her robe, and she worked to do what she could with her hair. Before long, she was part of the gathering crowd. People pointed and whispered and turned away while others glared their accusations. This was not unusual, but the stir of the crowd was. What was going on? She heard herself ask aloud. No one answered, but just a few feet away, she saw the man who had a name but was best known as unclean. Like her, he was an outcast with no friends, but today he was not alone. A rabbi was gripping his leprous shoulder and speaking to him. Most of the crowd watched in horror. How could a teacher of the people embrace one who was unclean? How could he violate such a sacred law and defile himself? Others seemed to be more curious than offended. Perhaps they had heard, as the woman had from her aunt, about a rabbi who was once a carpenter but now who cured sickness. Were they witnessing a miracle? The rabbi showing this kindness stirred something in the woman that she had not felt in a long while. The commotion turned to silence as the crowd strained to hear what the rabbi was saying. Suddenly, yet gently, the rabbi stood over the sobbing leper and helped him to his feet. As he stood, his body was straight and his skin was clean. As the commotion began to settle, the judging glare of the crowd again found her. But so had the stare of the rabbi. She wanted to understand what she was seeing. She longed for the compassion that she had just witnessed. She wanted to run to him. Could he somehow heal her of her loneliness, of her filth, of her despair? No, she concluded. After all she had done, she dared not believe it was possible. She dared not believe there was anything special enough about her to warrant his attention. She had made too many mistakes, too many lewd choices. Even this great healer could not heal her. She turned and walked away, yet her thoughts remained on the rabbi. She yearned to run back to him and ask who he was and why he was different, but her shame pushed her away. By the time she reached her lean-to, her home, she had never felt so broken. What hope was there for her? Why had she let her feelings be heartened by a strange rabbi? What could he or anyone do for her? For the next hour, she sat on her mat and painfully relived the past few years of her life. Finally, to cope, to feel better, she dug up the small alabaster box that was carefully buried beneath the dirt floor. This was a gift from the same rabbi-believing aunt who sacrificed 3 days of food to buy the perfume. It was given to remind the woman of her worth. Now it was the last token of respectability. She closed her eyes, opened the perfume, and drew a deep breath. On occasion, she would anoint herself with a sweet-smelling ointment. Although she knew it did nothing but really cover her dirt, it always made her feel better for a short time. But today, the fragrance was no match for her crushed spirit. So she sat there, holding the bottle in her hand as she reflected in desperation. Then, an out of nowhere impulse overwhelmed her. She was on her feet, walking, leaving her rickety residence, and somehow it felt her rickety past. Before long, she was running and clutching the alabaster box against her rapidly beating heart. There was no decorum in her gait, but she absolutely knew that she was going to the rabbi to anoint him with the only thing she had of value. She knew that she again was taking a risk, risking disappointment and humiliation, yet she pressed on because she somehow believed that this man was like no other, that her future was linked to him. But he was no longer in the town square. The crowd was gone. Unsure exactly where to go, a local vagabond pointed her to the well-known home of Simon. She hurried in that direction and found herself in the courtyard gazing inside the home. The rabbi was dining with a group of religious leaders, the same ones who had always treated her with disdain. She dare not intrude. She had imagined the encounter with the rabbi being like the one she had witnessed earlier in the day. Now that seemed impossible. This was not a place or occasion where a woman, and certainly not a woman of her reputation, would be welcomed. Tears began to fill her eyes for the first time in years. Her only hope seemed just beyond reach. But she could not. And she would not wait. She stumbled through the door, and before anyone could stop her, she was pouring ointment on the rabbi's dusty feet. Her tears blended with the ointment as her soul poured out her amassed hurt, pain, shame, and sorrow. She was oblivious to the disgust of the other men in the room and their conversation with the rabbi. She was focused on the rabbi, wondering if he would push her away. Rather, he placed his hand on her head, and she felt the touch of warmth and kindness. And dare she think, love? The tears poured from her years of disgrace and dripped on his feet. For the first time in her life, she felt loved without being exploited. She felt cared for rather than judged. She felt a peace that she had never known. It was hard for her to imagine that he would not scold her or demand that she put her life in order, but he did none of that. Instead, he looked into her eyes, he took her face in both hands, and spoke words she never imagined possible. Dear sister, your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go on and travel life's journey in peace. Forgiven? The ugliness of her life could be removed. Her humiliation could be taken away. He was seeing possibilities and worth in her. Was this new life now hers? As she went on to learn, the answer to all her questions was yes. And now each day began with a hint of the sweet-smelling balm. No longer as an aroma to cover her shame, it was the beautiful scent of hope, of compassion, and love. Listen, that's conjecture on my part, but you take some of the pieces you read in the New Testament and how it all brings together, maybe it's not too far off. Here was this woman who was broken, right? And yet had some hope in her. Not a lot, but still had some hope in her. And I think in that way, she's not unlike people that we encounter, not unlike us. Always some blend of brokenness and hope, searching for the right door to stumble through that potentially could change everything. And her decision to approach Jesus led her through a door that changed her life. And suddenly she had hope. You see, hope is this beautiful place where brokenness meets the gospel. Right? It's this beautiful place where that happens. One of my grandsons, Eli, did karate. And there was a poster up. And the poster is, I think it's a Japanese proverb. It said, a teacher can only open the door. It's up to the student to step through. And I remember the first time I saw that, it really stuck with me, that opening the door part. And I thought, man, sometimes there are people that don't know where to find the door that leads to healing. But man, do they want to? And often that's us. Often people shy away from the door of truth because it seems so narrow, but once it's gently opened, the other side, there's this vastness and a look of freedom. And I think many people will point to the door of grace, but never really go through it themselves or establish themselves as the guardian of it. The door of true adventure, I think it's one of the hardest ones to find, and almost always we need help from others to help us go through that door. We need to help others go through that door. I mean, there are so many doors, many more than I mentioned here. I'm sure many that you can think of, some that you've stepped through that brought about life change. But here's the thing, and I think where the Japanese proverb is missing something. Sometimes I think we do need to walk through the door with the people we help. It's like, come with me. Let me help you through that door. Or we need to help open the door for them that can walk through. And in a way, a lot of what we're talking about today, a lot of what is the focus around the world today in Orphan Sunday is, man, open a door for an orphan. Live the kind of life where you're going to be a door opener for those that are vulnerable, those that are struggling, whether it's your next door neighbor or it's someone around the world, whether it's a small child or an elderly person, no matter what walk of life, say, man, I want to be a door opener. And here's the thing. As a follower of Jesus, as someone who would lock and load here with Pinewood, guess what? You have more than enough to open doors. I don't know what you think you are, but if you had to funnel it all down, maybe your prayer would be, God, can you help me be a really good door opener? Because there are people who desperately need you to point to the door, walk them to the door, and sometimes open the door for them, because everything they ever dreamed of, everything they ever wanted is on the other side of their door, but in their state of brokenness, it's really hard for them to get there by themselves. And just maybe, God put you on this planet at this time specifically to help others through certain doors that you're going to be great at doing. Colossians 3 says this, and I think this kind of sums up sort of this posture we should have. It says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, okay, that's our base, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Man, if we live that out, imagine the kind of lives, the kind of impact we'd have. Bear with each other, forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on, what does it say? Love, right? Put on love. I don't know if it said that. Did it say it there? There it is. Okay, you guys, love. Okay, it's okay to read. It's okay. You guys can read this thing. Okay, it's okay. Love. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with wisdom and through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. You know, that's like a 10-week sermon series right there, that verse. But man, if we just have some handles in there that we'd hold on to. But I think at the core of all that, we just ask the question, we're in a situation. We're interacting with a person. Someone's come into our sphere, right? I think the question we always have to be asked, what does love require? Just that's it. It's like, man, my neighbor's going through it. What does love require? Wow, this person is celebrating. There's great joy. They're just killing it in life now. What does love require as I interact with them? And I think it usually blends up with some combination of compassion, right? Where you're extending an understanding and care to others when they have this need. Kindness. Lending courage. It's my favorite definition of kindness, that it's lending courage. I mean, you know how many people we as individuals, people beyond these doors, man, they just get sidetracked out of fear. But if we really understood that we had more than enough, we don't have to live in fear. It opens us up to be kind to others with humility, with a gentleness, with patience. And I think a big part of patience is just showing up with a hopeful attitude. Man, it's really bad today. Things aren't good today, but I trust in a God who's going to make it good one day, whether it be this side of heaven or not. It's a posture. Earlier, Parker talked about these postures, but it's a posture of generosity. It's a posture of being hospitable. It's offering up our more than enough, our resources, our time, our experiences, creating a space for those who need it. That's such an important thing. When I was a youth pastor, took a bunch of kids down to Mexico on the kind of the prototypical trip, and we were supposed to stay in these homes, and one of our youth group kids unintentionally locked himself out of this cinder block home where this group is supposed to be staying. It was the only keys. There's a door on the thing. And the dude who doesn't speak any English, he goes back to his kind of truck, broken down truck, and he takes out this sledgehammer. And my first thought is he's going to kill my kid. All right, that's the first thing that he's going to do. But he goes, and the guy takes the sledgehammer, and he literally breaks down the wall so that our kids can go in there because that's where they're staying, and then he rebuilds the wall to keep them safe on the inside. He said, man, if there isn't a beautiful picture of what we're supposed to do with people, you break down a wall so that people can get through where they need to go, and then you put the right kind of wall up to protect them from things that might harm them. I think it's just the gospel. That's what the gospel does. See, love requires us to step into the lives of others, making a difference, not in what we give, but I think a lot of it's in how we make people feel, right? That they feel known, that they feel loved, that they feel cared for, that they feel protected. And I was doing a quick survey. I was like, man, when I was a little kid, what are some memories that I have that were simple, super simple things, but changed the trajectory of my life forever? One of my earliest memories, I was 4 years old. It's one of my earliest memories. I remember going to church. It's the first time I ever remember going to church. My mom was a church lady, so I'm sure I was there a long time before that. But I walk in this little classroom, and there's this shortest little woman that I ever saw. Came to find out later, she's about 4'6" tall. Name was Dolores. And I don't know, she met me at my level pretty much. She met me right there. And she invited me in. And I just remember thinking how odd it looked that she was so short, but yet how wonderful this woman was. And I can remember whatever you can remember about being afraid at 4. And all of a sudden it's like, this is kind of a cool place to be. She opened the door, welcomed in this little 4-year-old redheaded, big-eared kid. And it was kind of like, it's going to be okay. 2.5 years after that, there was a lady, I still remember her name, Eunice Carson. She was an elderly lady. She ran this thing called Wise Owls at our church. And she opened the door. I went into this classroom with her. She laid out, the first time I can remember it, the good news of Jesus. She laid that out to the degree that it can make sense to a 6-year-old. I'm like, that makes sense to me. And it was there where it said, I want to be a follower of Jesus. That was an 80-year-old Eunice Carson who led this little 6-year-old Robbie Kelly to become a follower of Jesus. She opened the door, and I walked through that door. And I remember when I was in high school, going to church, and I was doing a lot of things that someone who follows Jesus probably shouldn't prioritize in their life, but I was doing it. I was pretty lukewarm in my faith. And there was a guy, an older guy, a postal carrier. And one day, I would help greet sometimes. He looked at me and he said, hey, he said, why don't you go to that church camp? I think Kelly, he said, Kelly, I think you should go to that church camp. And I'm like, okay, I'll go to that church camp. And it was at that church camp where the light really went on. I said, you know what? I think I want to follow Jesus and maybe vocationally serve him in some way. And that was just an older guy, a postal carrier, who just poured into me a little bit. He opened the door, and I walked through, and things changed dramatically. As Parker already shared, this is Orphan Sunday. And this started early 2000s over in Zambia. A pastor over there just said, man, we need to do something for the plight of the orphan. And he started something to pray for them, to care for them. And it took off. And before long, it really became this global movement where today, a lot of people of faith around the world gather to reflect on what is God's heart for orphans and what does it mean for us? What can we do? And so there's special services, there's prayer meetings, there's all these things, all to highlight the need of the orphans. But guess what? I know you know this is true. That really didn't start in the early 2000s. That's been God's heart from the beginning. I mean, you think of ancient Israel. Here's this place where there are these families and tribes. The families and tribes, they're everything. But there's also all of this vulnerability in this world, especially for the orphan and for the widow and the foreigner, those without family to protect them. And God sees that need. He speaks to his people about them, and he tells them that, hey, I'm the defender of the fatherless. You're my creation. You be the defender of the fatherless. Protect the widow. Care for those in need. In Deuteronomy 10, he declares himself the champion of the orphan, and he urges people to become family for the familyless, right? If you see someone without a family, you be their family. And that reflects God's own heart. In Isaiah, he says, there's this conflict and injustice going on, and one of the first things that Isaiah does is he calls people back to God's heart. He says, seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. And those were the prophet's words. They echo with this incredible power, a reminder of what true faith is, as Parker talked about just a little bit ago. And in the New Testament, there's this amazing metaphor of adoption, where it's God adopting children into his family, calling him his beloved sons and daughters. And he's calling us to extend that same love to others. To care for the orphans is not only a command, but a way of participating in God's work of justice and compassion. Right? It's not just a responsibility. If we only see it as a responsibility, we're missing it. But when you have the opportunity to help someone who's vulnerable, you know what that is? That's a privilege. It's a privilege to have more than enough, right? Why were we not born as a blind kid on the side of the hill in Tibet, 200 years ago? I have no clue, but we weren't. None of us in the room were. So we were born and set in a situation where we literally have more than enough. What are we going to do with it? It's a privilege to have more than enough. It's a privilege to extend our more than enough to others. More than just a responsibility. See, and I think the secret to changing your life isn't always just knowing what to do as much as how to get yourself to do it. You guys know the 10-second rule, right? It's like if food falls. Is that still a thing? I don't know. I'm old. Like food falls on the ground. 10 seconds, you can pick it up and eat it, and that's okay. Hands up. Yes, you guys heard that? Okay. By the way, I think we all know that's a complete lie, right? Because if your food falls on germs, you're going to have germs. But that's nevertheless, doesn't matter. But there's a 5-second rule. You know what the 5-second rule is? Anybody heard that? 5-second rule, a few of you know that. But the 5-second rule is this, that basically if you have this impulse to do something, especially something that's worthwhile or meaningful, but it's going to cost you something, then you have about 5 seconds to act on it, because at that point, your brain, which is all conditioned for survival, your brain's going to start kicking in. You're going to start overthinking. And if you don't do it in these 5 seconds, the odds are great that you'll never do it. Isn't that amazing? And so there's this lady, Mel Robbins, she wrote a book about it. It's pretty interesting. But she kind of flipped that around. She said, what she started doing is saying, I see that 5 seconds as a countdown. And so what she would think as a way to launch, like, man, here's something I really need to do. I need to get out of bed. I need to work out. I need to help someone. I need all these things. It's like when that impulse comes and that urge comes, she's like, okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to do something, right? I'm going to take action. So it's that countdown to launching. And the reason I share that today is I think for some of you, you might be moved to doing something, right? I know someone who adopted a family. I want to encourage them. Man, do that. If you wait, you won't do it. I want to maybe sponsor a kid. Do that. If you wait, you probably won't do it. So react in those 5 seconds. I'm not minimizing well thought out, reasoned decisions. Those are really good and important. Nor am I saying that reckless decision-making is good. It's really not. But sometimes we just know that's the right thing to do. And all the data would say that if we don't have a movement toward it in 5 seconds, we won't do it. And so we need to be about that. So let me tell you a little bit about compassion, just really quick. Compassion International, some of you are familiar with it, some of you are not. We work with about 2.3 million children around the world where poverty is the worst, which means it's families living on, an individual living on less than $1.20 a day. So think about that. Okay, that's the less than enough poverty side. And we come in with a holistic approach. Luke 2:12 says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, favor with God and man. In those 4 areas, you think about that, growing physically, growing spiritually, growing in your ability to navigate the world, growing in your ability to do relationships. When you're in poverty, unless there's outside intervention, it's almost impossible for that to change. And so compassion with a local church, we only work with the local church, through the local church, an individual sponsor like possibly you, then we're serving those children to help them grow in all of those areas. And help them become all that God intended them to be. And you never know what might happen by sponsoring a kid. And one quick story just to close out with, and I know Parker's going to come up and share just a little bit. But one of my fairly new friend, last 4 or 5 years, his name is Gerald, become a closer friend. But he was a sponsored compassion kid at one time. There's a ton of depth to this story. I won't go into all of it. But he grew up, life changed dramatically. Someone in a church service just like this said, I'm going to sponsor this little boy named Gerald. He did that. He grows up in a church. He goes off to college and develops. He ends up in the United States, in Florida, between the Florida and the DR. And his mom ends up having this brain tumor. And so they're going to these doctors and everything, and they go to this one doctor in the DR, and this other doctor on the other side of the curtain hears the name Gerald Lorenzo. And she comes through that curtain and says, is Gerald Lorenzo your son? And the mom said, yeah, that's my son. She says, I know Gerald Lorenzo. We grew up in the same compassion center. We went to school together after being in the compassion center, and she became one of the leading neurosurgeons in the entire world. And so guess who performed the surgery on Gerald's mom
to save her life and did it for free. And you know where that happened? You know why that's such a great story? Is because there's some people who maybe thought about it, maybe didn't even think about it. There were at least 2 people who said, I'm just going to sponsor a kid. Look at the God-honoring story that came from that. Last thing in the world I ever want to do is guilt anyone into do something. But I think you have the opportunity to potentially change the trajectory of a life today by sponsoring a kid, by having a heart that's going to help the neighbor in need, other children that you know of in need, supporting families here. They're doing foster care, adoption, all of those kinds of things. But here's the hidden secret in all that. You know whose life's going to most dramatically be changed? It's yours. It's yours. And so I'd invite you to go down that road and consider, man, not just sponsoring a kid with compassion, but how do you extend God's love and joy to those that are most vulnerable, that are already within your reach? How do you encourage and support those that are already doing that?